Hey everybody. So, I'd like to talk about how to model the human head at a very, very basic level. What you need to do when you're modeling 3D human heads is you need to understand some of the most fundamental structures of the human head, but those fundamental structures are different than the ones you learn when you're doing 2D art, or even when you're doing things like 3D art, but you're not sculpting. So, I want to teach you the basics that I use to try and keep my heads looking human. And this is very, very basic stuff. So if you already know how to model a human head, you can skip this. But I find that the biggest problem with newbies trying to model human heads is that their brain is much better at realizing that the human head is wrong than telling you how it's wrong. So you'll say, "Oh no, this head is wrong. I modeled something and it sucks, and I don't know how to fix it." And then that's incredibly discouraging. So instead, I'm going to go ahead and teach you what parts of the human head tend to not. You can't screw specific parts up, but everything else you can, basically. All of the meat can be pushed around as you see fit, but the fundamental bone structure has a couple of things to it that can't be ignored, and I'm going to teach you those. One thing worth noting, there are lots of reference heads. You can download them. Feel free to use them, but be careful you don't get caught making that specific head. Like if you use these reference heads, it's very likely that all your characters are going to look just like that. It's even worse with the anime heads. So when you are studying how to make a human head, be aware that there are a lot of different faces. Everybody has their own, and it's the fundamental underpinnings that you have to know and you have to study, not the basics of whether or not they have a sharp nose or whatever. So studying these things will often screw you up, and you'll end up drawing the same kind of head over and over rather than learning how to do it at a fundamental level. So we're going to start with a sphere, and what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and paint on the sphere just a little bit to show you how I think about this, because normally what we're told is to just drag down a jawline and then your head is done, right? There's this extremely popular opinion that all you have to do is drag down a jaw and then get modeling, and that's misleading enough that people actively suffer because of it. They don't understand what they've done wrong. They followed the instruction. Why isn't their head even vaguely reasonable? Well, that's because that's really not a very good approach. I mean, you do want to drag down the jaw. People have jaws, but you have to understand the basics of the human face far more than that. And so I'm going to go ahead and paint on this head and show you what I think about. Because when I think about the human face, I think about the planes of the face. Not the exact same planes that you would use when you are drawing a 2D thing, but instead, the most important plate of the face when you're modeling is the plate of the face, the upper jaw and the eye sockets like this. This plate is very, very critical to having a face that makes sense. And the other important thing to remember is that at the edge of your face here, there is a seam where the top and the bottom of your skull weld together. And that's going to produce some really, really critical folding in the face that you'll look very, very bad if you don't have it. And that folding is going to be when you look at the face from this angle, you're going to see the correct features, right? Otherwise, it's not going to look even vaguely nice. And you can pretend it's an anime face, but it's just wrong. So you're going to want to have this plane of the face be flat. Now, there's a couple of pieces to this. One piece is that this is just egg-shaped, and that's not correct. We're going to want to pull in the sides of our human head because the human head is not egg-shaped. It's shaped more like this. You don't have to worry about it being exact at this phase, but you want to make sure that you don't have a lot of extra width around the eye socket area, because that's the part that's generally going to cause you problems. Now, our painting is getting a little bit squished, but the eye socket, I guess I should update our paint so that it's more clear. The eye socket moves out to here, right? Like a Batman mask. So that's not flat at all. It's very, very round. How do you make it flat? Well, one thing we could do is to pull it back until it's flat, but that's obviously going to look really dumb up here. And this is roughly the right size for the head. I mean, it's a little bit further back, but it's roughly right. So what we really want to do is drag this forward and make it flat. Now, here's the key. You can't be too flat. You can be too round, but if you're too flat, you'll just fix it later. It's very, very easy to make things more round. It's much harder to make things more flat. So you want to get this mask really flat like that. You see how aggressively flat the painted surface is now? Now, obviously, it's not going to stay flat forever, but I recommend that you start it off as flat, at least until you're really comfortable with how that part of the head is going to look. I also usually pull out a neck just because that way I'll know what I want the jaw to look like. So there, now we got a neck too. When you get this far, the rest is what you're going to do with the bones of the face, and I recommend that you start with the eye socket. Now, the thing to remember about the eye socket, for me at least, thing I couldn't get for the longest time, is the way that it works at the edge here. So basically, this is where there is a seam between the upper plate and the lower plate of your skull. And therefore, when you look at it from the side, it's going to have a noticeable seam to it, and it's going to look a little bit like this. Now, that's not how it's going to look in the end, but that's the kind of divot that you want at that angle. And that's because there's an upper plate and a lower plate. Now, the specifics of exactly how much flesh there is coming down from the brow or over the edge of the cheek, the exact angle of the cheekbone, that sort of stuff is open for negotiation, but there's always going to be a crease there because that's how the human skull is structured. Similarly, the eye socket itself, when we dig down, it's always going to be fairly nice if we have had a flat surface to begin with, because the eye socket will be the right shape for an eye. It'll be a flat, hollow element for an eye. And this is really useful because if you've been putting eyes into your faces and you've noticed that your eyes never seem to sit quite right, they always float too far off to the side or whatever, it's probably because you haven't had a flat enough face to start with. And because of that, your eye hasn't had someplace flat to sit. Now, if you're doing anime, then you have to make some trade-offs there because the eyes are too big. But in basic form, you can have this setup where your eye socket is going to be able to hold an eye because you started with a flat surface. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about a more shallow eye socket or a deeper eye socket, the fundamental structure is going to be the same. And once you've done that, everything else is meat, and the question is where you put on your meat. So, for example, you can put in a nose of whatever shape you want, however broad you want, whatever you want to make it happen. Similarly, although we have talked about the fact that this is a flat surface, the meat that goes on top of your lip, the meat that goes on top of the upper jaw of your skull, that meat can be as big or as thin as you'd like it to be and can create any sort of shape you want it to be, because now we are putting on the meat. Oh, that's way too big. So I'll just smooth that down quite a bit. And you can put in a jaw. And although the jaw isn't really meat, it is something that can be changed depending on what sort of character you want to make. So it's fairly forgiving. All of this stuff down here is fairly forgiving in terms of how it's going to look by the end of the day. And in this case, it looks like our character has a fairly square jaw, but we've got his nose too low for my taste, so we're just going to move his nose back up a little bit, like here. And then we'll draw in some... Oop, I somehow turned off... There we are. I turned off X-axis mirroring on accident there. So when you're trying to build these lips, obviously we're not going to be doing too much of it right now. We're just trying to get the basic setup so that it looks vaguely correct. But this is a fairly straightforward way to build the human face. Now, depending on what you're trying to do, you can do a lot of stuff with adjusting this because it's just flesh. You can do basically whatever you want with it. You can give him a substantially bigger nose and all that stuff. But you have to be careful. The plane of the brow here, we've started to lose it, and now he's got a brow that's further back than his cheekbones. And so this is the sort of thing where you want to be a little bit careful. You want to make, if you do that sort of thing, you want to do it on purpose. It's very easy to accidentally drift out of true. So in ZBrush here, it's very easy to add in some eyes just by, right? That's a pretty big. Let's try a smaller set. And then we'll go ahead and make that its own subtool just so that we can edit it. In another program, you probably just started off as its own objects, but you'll move it back into the eye socket. Something like this will work fine, right? And you can paint it, make sure that it is correctly decorated for your needs. Right now I'm just putting it in there so you can see that it sits nicely inside of the eye socket because we have a flat eye socket. And if we switch over to the damn standard brush, which is what everybody that uses ZBrush swears by, we can quickly construct a nice eye socket, eyelids and the rest of the eye socket just by quickly stroking it in, and there you go. So now there's a lot of things you can do to change the shape of the eye and to do that sort of thing. But the basic idea here is that since we're working from a flat eye surface, when we first get started, we're working from a flat plane, the eyes will sit in there rather naturally. Even if they are not quite the right size, they're a little too large, a little too small, they'll sit in there rather nicely. You can continue to sculpt this to look exactly how you want it to look. The human face is fairly flexible, so it's something that you can do however you'd like. When you're doing the lips, you can go ahead and just use a damn standard brush to outline them, or whatever you'd like in your own program. It doesn't have to be this one. But there are still a couple of things about this face that we haven't talked about, and that is the meat, because the meat hangs off the human face in very specific ways. There's a lot different amounts of it and different levels of tension and stuff like that, but the meat of the face, it works in a very specific way. And basically the two creases that most people forget about or try and play down, this crease and this crease. Now that makes him look pretty old, but if you smooth it away, he'll still have those creases, but they're no longer going to be making him look old. Instead, they're just going to make him look like he's actually human instead of some kind of weird alien life form, made of plastic. So when you put in those creases, it's going to allow you to build up the face in a way that makes it more natural. After that, you can do pretty much whatever you want. There's also a crease under here, like this, and you can use that as much as you'd like or as little as you'd like to try and make your face jowlier or less jowly, whatever you need. But after that, you can play with this as much as you want. I haven't done any sort of work on what sort of person this is because I haven't touched any of his cheek fat or anything like that. So right now, it's just this random character I threw together in a heartbeat. And I don't have any clear idea of what he's supposed to be like. So we're going to sculpt in some more chiseled features like this. And you can see that it doesn't really matter how I affect the cheek. It's always going to look like a reasonable human face. Maybe a little bit stylized, but someone that if you saw them in a video game or whatever, you wouldn't be like, oh no, what's wrong with that guy? Instead, you'd be like, oh, I guess that's reasonable enough. So this is the sort of thing where as long as you understand the basic form of the human face, you can get a relatively decent human head out of it, even if you're a newbie. Now, there is a lot to say about the nature of the human skull behind the head, all the stuff back here. There's also a lot to say about whether or not you want to have different forms of cheeks and what you're going to do with the ears and that sort of stuff. There's a lot of stuff to do besides this part, but I didn't want this to run too long, so I figured this would be good enough. I hope this has helped.